So last week we introduced the idea of market research and talked a little bit about how we categorize market research into qualitative and quantitative, into primary and secondary. So today we're going to look at different types of primary research that marketers use. And this is going to be a lot of information coming at you, but it's essentially just how are the different ways that you can get information about a customer and specifically get the information you need to help shape your 4 Ps in your marketing. So you have a good idea of a product or a target market, but you want to get a little bit more feedback and ideas of whether or not the target market likes your product. These are the ways you can go about doing that. So the first one is what we call face-to-face or telephone interviews. And this is basically a one-on-one, very much like you just did with the consumer problem-solving assignment. You sat down one-on-one, asked some questions to get information. The nice thing about that is it allows for depth in your answers. You can follow up if a particular particular answer seems interesting to you or might seem like they have more to say. You can follow up, as opposed to a dry survey, which you take online and you just answer the questions that you get asked. Okay. There's also a bit of an ability to communicate through or to record the communication of body language. And people oftentimes will communicate more through their body than they do through their words. Sometimes up to 90% of our communication is body language and facial expressions. So in a face-to-face interview, you're able to capture some of that. So a person might say they really enjoy your product, but they give a disgusted face. That's a good example of their body telling you a bit more than their words do. The problem, and you probably found this with the interviews, it takes a lot of time, and therefore it's very expensive to conduct. You can only do one person at a time, and oftentimes it's difficult to find participants. Don't know if you've ever been called at home during dinner, but people frequently do not want to give telephone interviews, especially if it's unsolicited. Face-to-face is also very difficult to do. People just don't like to sit for it. And it takes a long time to do. There's also a potential problem with doing this in that we can have bias from the researchers, or you might say the researchers can be biased. They tend to influence or prejudice the interviewees towards a certain answer. They can do that in a couple of different ways: how you word the question, how you say the question. What did you think of Coca-Cola, or what did you think of Coca-Cola? Very subtle. So you need researchers who are somewhat well-trained to make sure that there isn't any bias whatsoever. You're not leading your interviewees towards something. And of course, if you're doing face-to-face interviews, oftentimes the interviewee will tell you what you want to hear, or will try to tell you what you want to hear. So it can negate some of the value of the research. Part of the way to get over the expense and the difficulty of face-to-face research is to do focus groups, very popular in marketing. Focus group is a group of people that you interview at once. It is less costly than one-on-one, but a little bit more difficult to manage because you have certain group psychology coming into play, like peer pressure. So you need your researchers to be trained not only to not show bias, but also to help mitigate some of that groupthink. Observation is better for, let me go back one. Face-to-face focus groups, these are really good for giving people an existing product and seeing what they think of it. Having them play around with it, see it from all different angles. That is a great way to see how people interact with it. Gives you a lot of depth, but of course that's for an existing product or maybe a prototype of a product. Observation. Observation is unique in that you basically just watch your customers and record the behavior. The idea being that you try not to be observed, because when you're observed by people, they change their behavior. Okay? A really gross example of this is washing your hands when coming out of the bathroom. When people thought they were being observed, they tended to wash their hands, I think it was 30% more times in one study than if they just left the bathroom on their own. So when people think they're being observed, they tend to change their behavior for the better, usually. Observation doesn't allow for a lot of depth because you're not following up with people. You're just literally watching them. And retail stores will do this frequently. They'll watch how you walk through the aisles, where you stop, where your eye levels are, etc. Gives them a lot of information that you yourself might not even convey. You might not even know what you're doing. So it's some of the unconscious behaviors. But again, somewhat limited in terms of what it can tell me and where I can use it. Secret Shopper is a little bit different, but again, usually used by retailers. You can actually get paid to shop. The company will hire you, let's say Staples will hire you to go to a Staples and shop there. And afterwards, when you leave the store, you fill out the survey online that tells them all about who helped you, when did they help you, how often did they ask you for, if you needed help, how long did they spend with you, a lot of detailed questions. So not just everybody can do it. You have to be a little bit trained in marketing and be able to observe a whole lot of stuff and then record it later. Obviously, this is really good for judging customer satisfaction. When somebody leaves the store and submits a review online, you get a lot of feedback as to how your retail store is operating. However, there can be some question about the ethics. In other words, oftentimes it's used for spying on employees, and employees don't like secret shoppers. They feel like it's dishonest and not necessarily fair. I mean, you go in and you get helped by someone who has a really bad attitude, so the store gets a bad rating and that employee gets reprimanded. Well, maybe they had a bad day. And normally they're a really great, helpful employee. So that one time that the secret shopper came in just kind of ruined them. So there's some question as to how useful it is, but companies still use this just to see how their employees are running things in their retail stores. Also, shoppers can be a bit biased in the reports. They can bias the reports towards or against certain employees if they don't like them. Probably the one you're most familiar with in terms of marketing research is surveys. And in fact, you guys have examples of this. You've done the Tell Them From Me survey at least once in your academic careers in high school. It's similar to an interview. You're asked a series of questions. The benefit of a survey over an interview is that it's easier to implement. I just roll out a whole bunch of surveys through email, through a website, and I can gather all that data and analyze it very easily as well. The drawback is you don't get the same depth as an interview because people may not answer a question, or they answer in such a way, but they don't provide depth. I'm sure if you guys think about your own personal experiences with the Tell Them From Me survey, you get the idea that you generally don't answer long answer questions in much depth. There's also the possibility for inaccurate results from things like self-reporting errors, self-reporting bias. We generally don't report on ourselves honestly. We tend to want to make ourselves look better than we are. We may also omit certain answers, meaning you don't answer certain questions, or you even lie. There might be for example, the Tell Them From Me survey, there's usually a question about how many of you have tried cocaine. I'm sure there are a few students who thought it was funny to say yes, they had, even though they hadn't. On the other hand, there are probably students who have tried cocaine who didn't answer the question or maybe didn't even take the survey. So if a survey is well crafted, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, you get a decent understanding of a general population, a target market. There might be some errors in it, but if you do it well enough and you survey enough people, you probably get those errors to balance out. So it's a very frequently used, most frequently used type. Diaries, very different. What a diary is, and this is not often used, basically a company will give a consumer a diary to record events. And the idea is that they're recording more of their emotions and more of the events surrounding their purchases than just the purchase itself. So Coca-Cola gives you a diary, and for the next month, every time you drink a Coke, you're going to write in the diary how many, or maybe once a day, how many Cokes did you drink, what were the circumstances, how did it make you feel, etc. Allows for the same kind of depth as an interview, but without the time because you're not sitting one-on-one. However, it does fall prey to the same type of errors, self-reporting errors. You're going to probably be more generous with yourself. And it is incredibly difficult to analyze because you have to have someone go through those diaries. It's useful for certain circumstances to kind of get a general sense of how people operate as consumers, but not necessarily. It's a little too in-depth for a simple thing like, do you like Coke or not? So a simple survey will usually be more for judging your feelings and opinions. A diary is more getting a sense of how teenagers shop or what the average teenage day is, something like that. The last one is experimentation. And this usually runs, we call these taste tests often, although you can do it with anything. The idea is that you want to give the product to the consumer and get them to give you feedback, judge it based on its use or their interaction with the product. And because this is often time-consuming, difficult to do, it can be pretty limited in terms of sampling size. In other words, you don't get a whole lot of people to do it. So you have to be cautious. If I give, for instance, if we give a taste test in the White Oaks, you've seen those before with chips or soda, odds are that no soda company would really think that was great research because it's such a small sampling size. You're literally just getting 40, 50 different people's opinions. And they're really not a variety of people either. They're all high school students. However, you can get a lot of information off of a taste test that you would not get off of even an interview or a survey. You're actually forcing the people to interact with the product. So if I was doing a taste test of Coke versus Pepsi, you would see people's reactions. You would see people perhaps linger over one product over the other. You even get a sense of how they approach the product. Did they gulp a whole glass of Coke, or did they just sip each one? So a taste test gives me a bit of a combination of that interactivity of a focus group, some depth to it as well. It's just not necessarily easily extrapolated to a whole population. The other benefit is experimentation doesn't really require a highly trained staff to do. Okay. What I'd like you to do now, there's a handout on the lesson, and I'd just like you to submit the answers. For each scenario, I want you to choose the best one or two methods for completing the research, one of these primary methods. Which one do you think makes the most sense? Think about their pros and cons in the situation. Make sure you justify your answer by referencing the scenario or case information as well as the method's benefits or drawbacks. You don't have to say why you wouldn't choose the other ones, but choose one or two and really explain why it's the best option.